The magical pivot table will give you the superpower to get an insight into data at your fingertips. You should pay attention to the rules of pivot table. The header field of source data must be complete when creating a pivot table, and there must be no blank or merged cells. Otherwise, an error alert will appear. We can continue to create the pivot table after completing the header. Also, we need to examine the data format of the source table. In this case, the pivot table report is normal at first glance. If the data for January is written incorrectly, errors will appear in the pivot table when we refresh, and these dates cannot be grouped. This is not what we want. How can we fix it? Select this part and click Text to Columns. Click Next twice and set the date format. Finally, click Finish. Click Refresh All to update the pivot table. Now you can group dates after fixing. Furthermore, if the summary values contain text numbers or merged cells, the results will show errors. If you face errors when utilizing pivot tables, you may seek explanations in the above aspects. Some students find the pivot table's default format unappealing. The strategies outlined below can make it more appealing and suitable for our reading habits. Step 1. Use the built-in pivot table styles. You can find all the beautifying features in the Design tab. Select the pivot table and click the drop-down option to select the style you want. You can also specify where the style should be applied by selecting row header, column header, banded rows, or banded columns. Step 2. Adjust the summary information. Select the pivot table and then select subtotals from the drop-down menu. You may change the location of subtotals and choose whether or not to hide them. Step 3. Hide grand totals. Subtotals are added to the bottom and right side by default. To make them less obtrusive, we can click On for Column Only at Grand Totals to hide the rightmost subtotal. You can customize it on your own. Step 4. Report Layout. A pivot table differs from a normal table in several ways, which contributes to its odd appearance. Clicking the Report Layout button, you can pick multiple layout styles. You can also select Show in Tabular Form to use a conventional table format. Step 5. Change the header as required. Double-click the cell to rename it. The new name cannot be the same as the original table's header. The system will prevent you from changing Sum of Sales Amount to Sales Amount. It's simple to fix it. You can add a space in the front. You can also click Options and click to cancel plus or minus buttons and field headers. There are some unsightly blank cells. We may make them display as 0. Right-click the blank cell in the pop-up dialog box, select Options from the menu, and then head to Format. Check for Empty Cells Show and enter 0 in the box. Finally, click OK. After you've completed these procedures, did you find the pivot table more fresh and clear? Until now, I believe you've learned the pivot table so well, but we can achieve more than that. Your leader will not be satisfied with a pivot table data summary. Pivot chart may be used to visualize the data's rules and issues. Next, I'll teach you how to create a pivot chart. Select the original pivot table, click the Insert tab, and click Pivot Chart. At this time, you can choose various charts in the pop-up dialog. You can choose a suitable chart, such as a column chart. To make it more appealing, click the Style drop-down menu and select an appropriate style to make it more appealing. Select all dividing lines in the charts and press Delete to remove them. The fields in the pivot chart areas on the right determine how the pivot chart displays. The chart will update itself as we modify the fields. The x-axis of the chart corresponds to the rows area, and the y-axis corresponds to the values area. If we drag order date into axis category and sales into values, The x-axis of the chart will show the order date, while the y-axis will tell you the value of sales. The graph now shows the total sales volume of all products in 12 months. Let's drag product into Legend series to better compare the sales volume of each product and make them display in different colored columns. iPhone 12 outsells other products in the fourth quarter. Each field dragged into the pivot chart area will generate a rounded rectangle button in the chart, and you can use them to filter data. Suppose I want to compare the sales of iPhone 11 and iPhone 12 mini in the first quarter. We can click the product menu and select iPhone 11 and iPhone 12 mini. Finally, click OK. Then click Order Date and select the second quarter. In this way, the pivot table and pivot chart will synchronize the information of the specified product. Suppose that September to December sells phones best, and we want to compare the overall sales of 4 goods throughout this time. There are 2 steps. First, click the Order Date button, select Date Filter, and select Between. In the pop-up dialog box, enter 01/09/2021 and 31/12/2021 and click OK. 2 groups of columns will appear because September is the third quarter and October, November, and December are in the fourth quarter. To group them together, we can right-click Order Date and group the dates. Finally, click Year. In this way, the chart will show the real-time sales of 4 products in the specified time period. Now we can compare the sales of these 4 products. Some students may raise a new question. How can I further compare different storage? Let's drag storage into calls. Now several columns with colors appear in the pivot chart. Too many colors may affect the judgment of data. Lots of data can be displayed clearly in a pivot table, but will make a pivot chart confusing to read. Let's first remove storage from calls and see whether there are any other solutions. Today, I want to show you the slicer, a fantastic tool hidden in the pivot table. Select the pivot table and click Insert Slicer in the Option tab to pop up all fields. In this case, let's select Storage and click OK. Now we have inserted a movable slicer that contains 64 gigs, 128 gigs, and 256 gigs. Click 64 gigs, and all products with a 64 gig storage will display in both pivot table and pivot chart. Similarly, click 128 gigs and the system will show the products with a 128 gig storage. The slicer can cut the data into slices. There are 2 benefits. First, data can be filtered quickly. Did you find that the slicer works smoothly and quickly compared with the filter button in pivot table? Second, it can display the field that has not been added to the pivot table area. Back to the case, we didn't drag storage into any pivot table area, but we can still show it using the slicer. Suppose I want to check how sales vary among cities. Click the Insert Slicer button and select City. Creating multiple slicers is possible. We can select a single city or press Ctrl to select multiple cities. Slicer is the perfect choice for displaying multiple categories. You can display the specified data with your fingertips. Some students may find the slicer too obtrusive in the sheet. Let's simply beautify it. First, select the slicer and unify the style. You can customize it as needed. Second, adjust the columns of the slicer to shift the button direction from vertical to horizontal. Third, adjust button height and button width to fit in the pivot chart report. Finally, adjust the size of the slicer and move it to an appropriate position. Now we've finished the slicer. We've learned why errors show in a pivot table, how to beautify a pivot table, and create a pivot chart and a slicer. We should standardize the original table. Blank cells in fields, irregular dates format, merged cells, or numerical text in numerical values will trigger errors. Pivot chart can show the data trend. The x-axis will show the fields in rows, while the y-axis will present the fields in values. Slicer can show your leader what they want to see, including fields that aren't in the pivot table. The chart we introduced in this lesson is just the tip of the iceberg. The next chapter will cover data visualization and help you master charts.